Today in Aetherdrift, we get our exclusive MTGGoldfish preview card and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Aetherdrift spoilers. So we kick off week 2 of spoiler season with a pretty exciting day featuring our exclusive preview card thanks to Wizards. So I'm gonna stop rambling, let's get to this week's cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Aetherdrift. So first up today, we have our exclusive MTGGoldfish preview card. Thank you to Wizards for hooking us up. And I already wrote an entire article on this card, so I'm not going to go super crazy in depth on this one. Check out the article over at mtggoldfish.com. But we have our Azorius Gearhulk in Riptide Gearhulk. So Riptide Gearhulk, 1 double blue, double white for a 2/5 double striking prowess creature that when it enters, you get to put a non-land permanent that each opponent controls in their library third from the top. So Riptide Gearhulk, its ETB ability kind of calls back to another Azorius 5-drop in Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. We got to see Teferi's -3 be super annoying removal, and I think that that's the biggest calling point of this card. We've talked a lot this spoiler season, how especially for expensive cards that are, 4, 5, 6 mana, really difficult in our current this town ain't big enough standard to play things that don't do something right away. Riptide Gearhulk passes this test. You play the Riptide Gearhulk, worst case your opponent bounces it or kills it. Well, you tuck something into their library, you got some at least temporary removal out of it, and even though the removal is temporary, it's actually not a bad form of removal. Not only do you get rid of your opponent's best thing for a few turns, but then they're gonna have to spend mana to recast it, or maybe you put something bad in their deck and they're gonna get a dead draw out of it. So I think it's actually pretty powerful removal. The other exciting part about this card is the combination of double strike and prowess. So we've really never seen Wizards aggressively print a card like this. The closest comparison, actually the only double strike prowess creature that I could find in Magic, was Dragon Style Twins. And Dragon Style Twins just wasn't good enough. It's a 5 mana 3/3 double strike prowess, no other ETBs or anything like that. So I feel like this is a huge upgrade, and I can imagine a world where you play Riptide Gearhulk, you get rid of your opponent's blocker, you get rid of their best thing, you untap the next turn and sling a bunch of spells, and hit your opponent for like 10 damage, 12 damage, because of double strike and prowess. This is actually a way scarier clock than it looks. At first glance, you're like, oh my god, 2/5, like for 5 mana, that's horrible. But double strike and prowess means you can grow this thing's power really, really quickly. So the question for this card is, where does it fit in standard? And that's honestly my biggest issue with this card. I don't see a ready-built tier home. It's probably going to be at its best if you can like bounce it and blink it and have a lot of spells in your deck. At first I was like, okay, can we play this in the Esper self-bounce deck, the Esper Pixie deck? And I think it's probably just too expensive. On one hand, you don't really want to be this towning a 5-drop and recasting it. That's just so much mana. Although, we have seen the Esper deck not really be scared of expensive loops. Like, think about Storm Chaser's talent this town. That's also really expensive to loop every turn. So maybe there's a world where it would be fine. The good news about playing it in something like the Esper Pixie deck is the deck's actually oddly good at triggering prowess. You have those turns where you're like, Hopeless Nightmare, bounce by Hopeless Nightmare, replay Hopeless Nightmare, and all of a sudden you're getting hit by this like huge prowess otter. Imagine doing that same thing but with a 2/5 double strike prowess on the table. You're gonna get through a ton of damage really quick. I just don't know if those decks care that much about closing out the game super quickly. On the other hand, if you shift over a little bit and maybe you're playing more scroll shift effects and less this town effects, then this card becomes really good. If you play this and then like scroll shift it and tuck 2 of your opponent's things, that is a potentially game-winning line. The other place this card could fit, and again, I'm not sure you really want it there, but some of the like Honeygen Oculus decks, they have lots of spells. You play this as removal, then you sling a bunch of spells and make it huge and hit your opponent for a ton of damage. But again, does your Helping Hands deck really want a 5-drop? I'm not exactly sure. It could also be a good control finisher. I just don't really see a true control deck in this standard. Like, we haven't seen traditional like blue-white Drago control actually be that effective, so I don't know if there's a home there either. So I feel like this is a playable card, a good card, a strong card. I'm just not sure it has a ready-built home in standard right now. As far as Commander is concerned, I think there is one really obvious home for Riptide Gearhulk, and then a couple of maybe homes. So the obvious home, Blink style decks. I think in a Blink deck like Brago or Rune or Yarion, this card's great because remember, it scales with the table. You get to tuck something of each of your opponents. So this is coming down, hitting each of your opponent's best thing, which is already fine for 5 mana. It leaves behind what I think is actually a reasonable body thanks to prowess and double strike. And then if you're playing Brago or Rune or Yarion or something, you can probably blink it a bunch of times. Imagine just like blinking it enough times to tuck your opponents all of their non-lands into their deck and make them draw it over the course of like the next 10 turns or something. Sounds absolutely hilarious. The other places this card could work, but I'm not as sold, is maybe artifact decks, because it is an artifact, remember. I think specifically of like Urza Chief Artificer, which not only cares about artifacts, but specifically about artifact creatures. In a deck like that, it's an artifact that's a creature, and it works as a removal spell. Seems good there. Maybe spell slinger decks like Narset and Light and Exile. If you're just slinging a bunch of spells, you play this as a removal and cast a bunch of spells, and it gets really big. So I think those are the homes that are less obvious than the Blink decks, but still, it could be very good there. So Riptide Gearhulk, the card seems really sweet. Like I said, I don't know if there's a perfect home for it in Standard, but remember, this card's going to be in Standard for like 3 years. So even if there isn't right away, there's a decent chance that sooner or later that home will come along. In the meantime, it seems like a really powerful card for Blink decks and Commander, and a card that, if you can find the right home, could be very strong in Standard as well. We also got another max speed start your engines 1-drop in Guzzler, which is, I guess, the Zoolander of the Apocalypse? I can't unsee Ben Stiller in this card, but it's a 1-mana black 2/1 with start your engines. It enters tapped, and then max speed, play a black, sack a creature, another creature or vehicle, you get to draw a card. So Guzzler, I think this card's actually pretty good. We've talked about a lot during spoiler season, how if max speed is going to be good, you really want these aggressive 1-drops to start your engines early, start getting in, building up your speed to eventually turn on all your cards. I think this is going to be one of the best black options we've seen. If you think about what the card is, it's kind of like a Cult Conscripts as a black Savannah Lions that enters tapped, except the upside is starting your engines and eventually getting an upgraded Dockside Chef max speed mode, where paying 1 to sack a creature or vehicle to draw a card, actually a pretty good deal if you can get to it. So Guzzler joins Nesting Bot is our second 1-drop that can start your engines. We'll have to wait and see. Does each color get one of these? Is it something just black and white? Yeah, I think what 1-drops have start your engines is probably going to determine which colors of max speed are going to be most playable in Standard. I think they're that important to the archetype working. If you're not starting your engines till turn 3 or turn 4 or even turn 2, I'm afraid it's going to be too slow in a lot of matchups. But if you're starting on turn 1, and doubly so if you can start on turn 1 and getting a hit on turn 2, then you're off to the races for eventually achieving max speed relatively early in the game. So I think this card's going to be important there. So this card supports black based max speed deck. So I'm looking at like Zahur, maybe Embalmed Descendant, Far Fortune End Boss. You can see the pieces of some sort of like weird Orzhov max speed sacrifice deck. Like Zahur cares about sacrificing stuff. Once you get to max speed, becomes really good in his sack deck because you get a token whenever you sack a non-token. Embalmed Descendant upgrades into this bigger, better Blood Artist once you get to max speed. So maybe there's some sort of weird like max speed aggro sacrifice style deck with Guzzler being a key piece to it. It's also a vampire, which could be relevant in Standard. Not only are vampires supported in Standard, although they haven't really been good in Standard, but not only are vampires supported, but if you look at vampires, they actually have a pretty heavy sacrifice theme. You got cards like Bart and Immerstorm Predator, Sacrifice, Callisteria Highborn, Vito want you to be sacrificing. So Guzzler seems like a natural fit there. It's like a on-tribe 1-drop that also works with the aristocrat sub-theme of the tribe. Then we have older formats where this card seems perfect for like a Cauldron Familiar Mayhem Devil deck. I think it's going to be worth trying, at least in Pioneer. Whether or not it's fast enough, that's kind of the question. Although, if you look at the sack decks, they're not like super fast anyway. They're more like grindy late game decks, so maybe it's fine. But if you have Cauldron Familiar going or Mayhem Devil, it should be pretty easy to have your opponent lose a life on each of your turns. So you should be able to get up to max speed relatively quickly. And then Guzzler gives you a card that can just generate a huge amount of card advantage once you get to that point, thanks to its max speed mode. As far far as Commander is concerned, I think this is mostly a card for decks that care about its creature type. So if you're playing vampires, especially sacrifice vampires like Cavaleno or Carmen, then this seems like a nice one drop for your deck. Also seems sweet in Strephon, just because Strephon is kind of built to hit your opponents for damage during each of your turns because of its ability, so you should turn on max speed relatively consistently, just because that's what your deck's trying to do. Could also be a rogue card. I think it's maybe less good in rogues, because rogues doesn't really have the sacrifice sub-theme that you see in vampires sometimes, but still, it is a one-drop rogue, so notable there. The other places could see play is just in sacrifice aristocrat style decks, like Tisa Karlov or Yawgmoth or Yara. There, I'm just really not sure. This max speed start your engines mechanic is so incredibly tricky to evaluate in Commander in specific. The question is, are you going to have a critical mass of good max speed cards that you're more or less guaranteed to draw one early? Because if you're just playing Gas Guzzler and this is your only max speed card, the card's pretty bad, right? You got 99 cards in your deck. Your odds of drawing this one are not super high. And if you draw this on turn 6 or something, you're not going to turn on max speed in time for it to actually matter in the game. So the question is there going to be enough of a critical mass of start your engines cards for this mechanic to even work in Commander? I'm sure you can build like a dedicated max speed deck where that's your whole goal is to turn on max speed, but are there enough good max speed cards that you can build like an aristocrat deck and still turn on start your engines, still get to max speed in a timely manner? That's what I'm not exactly sure about. So we're gonna have to wait and see if the mechanic even really works in Commander, but if it does, I could see this showing up in sack decks. So Gas Guzzler seems like a really important start your engines cards for standard, maybe some support for vampires or rogues, and if the mechanic's good enough, could also be good in some Commander decks, especially those vampire sack decks. We also got a new blue mill artifact in Riverchurn Monument, which appears to be some sort of water park along the raceway. I do not know what's going on with this set, but it's a 2-mana artifact. You pay 1, tap it, any number of target players mill 2 cards, and an exhaust of 4 and tap to make any number of target players mill cards equal to the number of cards in their graveyard. So Riverchurn Monument, it's basically upgraded 2025 millstone, except you do need to be in blue, so it's not really a strict upgrade, but it's like a millstone that can hit everyone, only costs 1 to activate, and then its exhaust mode is kind of a one-shot cheaper keening stone, and that mode I think could be pretty exciting in some sort of mill deck. So what do you do with this card? So one option is you play this to try to fill your own graveyard, and I feel like in general there's probably better options for this, but in some sort of delirium deck or zombify deck, a reanimator, some sort of Eddie Merc Crab deck, it could be in the conversation for the right build of that deck, where you're just every turn milling a couple cards, stocking up your graveyard, setting up your synergies. More likely though, I think this card is going to see play as an Aetherian Roundyard, where you're using this to mill your opponent's deck repeatedly, and I think we actually have the pieces for this in standard. If you add in Jace the Perfected Mind, really great mill card, Realmbreaker the Invasion Tree, Teresian Mindbreaker, maybe the Mind Skinner, I'm actually really hyped to try building mill in standard. I don't know if it's going to be any good, but it seems very possible that we could actually have a successful mill deck. Imagine just like Jace the Perfected Mind, mill you for 15, Riverchurn Monument, exhaust mode, you're going to mill for at least 15 more. If you have some more mill in there, I can imagine get to 6 mana to play an exhaust Riverchurn Monument, just winning the game on the spot. Of course, this plan does get a lot worse if there's like a Rest in Peace or Graveyard Hate, so there are ways to play around it. Also in the mill deck, it's pretty notable that you can mill yourself to mill over like a Teresian Mindbreaker and then unearth it to be able to mill half your opponent's deck. So you can see the pieces there for some sort of mill deck. In Commander, I think it's mostly the same equation. If your deck cares about milling your opponent, and doubly so, if your deck cares about milling your opponent and milling yourself, like maybe a Sidisi mill deck, then I think this card's pretty good. Like technically it's 1 mana tap, mill 8 cards if you mill the entire table, which is a pretty efficient rate. And then the exhaust mode, like we were talking about before, could just close out the game. So Riverchurn Monument, I really like this card. I'm excited to try mill in standard, and it should have some home in some Commander mill decks too. As far as lower rarity cards, there are a couple that deserve a shout out, including Transit Mage. So Transit Mage, 3 mana 2/2 human wizard. When it enters, you may search your library for an artifact card with mana value 4 or 5, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So this card, if it looks familiar, it completes a cycle that Wizards has been working on for 20 years now. This is the Trinket Mage cycle. So way back in 5th Thought, in like 2003, we got Trinket Mage, which tutors up an artifact, mana value 1 or less, so 1 or 0. Then later we got Tribute Mage, which snags artifacts mana value 2, Trophy Mage, mana value 3, now we have Transit Mage 4 or 5, and then Treasure Mage 6+. So now if you want to tutor up an artifact in your blue deck, you have a 3-drop 2/2 that is going to be able to do it no matter what artifact you're looking for. I also like to imagine that this is a Joven's long-lost love child. Just, you can see the family resemblance. This also looks like you went to a show in a really sketchy bar and didn't dress right and almost got killed and then you got kicked out or something. A lot going on with the flavor and art of this card. As far as what you do with this card, I think it's a card that you play if there's a very specific 4 or 5 mana artifact that you want. So for example, in Standard, this could be a really good Aether Spark card, right? So you play this on 3, you get your Aether Spark. On 4, you Aether Spark. Worst case, you plus and attach it to the Transit Mage. You can swing and start building up some loyalty. So maybe that's enough for it to see play in Standard. In older formats like Legacy, maybe this could be a 1-ring tutor. It finds the 1 ring. It also pitches to Force of Will. So those are the kind of things you're looking for with this card. You don't just play it for value, but if you have a 4 or 5 mana artifact that's really important to your game plan, then this is a fine option to find it. So Transit Mage, more of a niche card, but it's cool to see the Trinket Mage cycle completed, and I think it's a card that could have uses in the right deck. We also got a new 2-mana green enchantment in Dredger's Insight. So 2 mana, when it enters, you mill 4 cards, and you put an artifact, creature, or land card from among the milled cards into your hand, and then when 1 or more artifacts and your creatures leaves your graveyard, you get to gain 1 life. So Dredger's Insight, it's basically a twist on like Malevolent Rumble, Cash Grab. We've seen these cards see a lot of play recently. I think in a vacuum, Dredger's Insight is worse than these cards, right? The other ones hit any permanent. Cash Grab's also an instant, but there is some upsides to being an enchantment. So I'm not saying that your Malevolent Rumble deck is going to drop your Malevolent Rumbles for Dredger's Insight, but one thing I've learned from Standard is you don't want to underestimate a spell effect being stuck on an enchantment, because we've seen this town and these cheap enchantments with ETB effects be so good in Standard. So this is kind of a Malevolent Rumble that you can this town back to your hand and reuse, or maybe you're playing some enchantment synergies. The only problem with this card is, where does it fit exactly? If you look at green decks in Standard that are trying to fill their graveyard, I think of like the Tolarian Terror, Eddie Mert Crab deck. The problem is that deck really wants spells. Like, you don't really want an enchantment filling your graveyard, because the enchantment's not going to reduce the cost on your Eddie Mert Crab or Tolarian Terror. So that's a little bit awkward, but that's the kind of shell it could work in. We also have, like I mentioned, enchantment synergies, Entity Tracker, Optimistic Scavenger. In a deck playing these cards, this is basically a Malevolent Rumble that's also going to trigger all your Eerie stuff, trigger all your Constellation stuff, and gain you a little bit of life, which is a nice bonus against aggro. So Dredger's Insight, not like a broken card or anything, but I could see this being a solid role player in a deck that's digging for certain pieces, wanting to fill the graveyard, and cares about an enchantment. We also got some card draw for artifact decks in Voyage Home. So Voyage Home, 7 mana sorcery. You draw 3 cards, you gain 3 life, but it has affinity for artifacts. So if you have at least 5 artifacts, you can cast it for a white mana in a blue mana, and I feel like this card should be pretty sweet. We've seen in the past affinity card draw, Thoughtcast, Thought Monitor, be staples all the way back to Legacy. Like, Legacy 8 cast is built around these cards. Modern, these cards see play. I don't think Voyage Home is going to replace these cards in Legacy or in Modern, just because in Eternal formats, I think a 1 mana draw 2 probably better than a 2 mana 2 color draw 3 gain 3. However, this gives us something similar that we can play in Standard, which has me really hyped to try the artifact deck. We're getting the Aether Spark. We already have a ton of really powerful artifacts, Simulacrum Synthesizer, Thousand Moon Smithy, hanging out. So I feel like Voyage Home, maybe this is the missing piece to take a blue-white artifact deck in Standard and turn it from like tier 3 into tier 1 and like a legit one of the best decks in the format. So very excited for that. I also think this card should be really good in Commander. In Commander, I love draw 3s for 3. This is theoretically a draw 3 for 2, which is even better, assuming you're an artifact deck. So Voyage Home, maybe not quite good enough for Modern, although maybe it surprises me and finds its way into Modern. Worst case, this is our new Thought Monitor or Thoughtcast for Standard and for Commander decks. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Aetherdrift spoilers for today. So what do you think as we head into week 2? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with another one. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find our last spoiler video here, or maybe check out the Mucha Brew, where we played 20 hair appearances in Standard.